going to go through here first of all is what the Arctic is all about. What's the far north really about? And then I'll dive into the game mechanics. And I'm going to do this as quickly as possible, and hopefully I don't insult anybody's intelligence. So, any discussion of the polar regions of the world must take into consideration the distortions of flat maps on a spherical world. Typically, we use a Mercator projection, which is cylindrical and severely distorts the area and distance near the poles, making Greenland appear comparable in size to Africa. Thus, the Arctic impact is that the distances between polar locations are greatly exaggerated. It's for that reason that we tend to use polar projection maps. These maps preserve the true distance from the center point, which is in this case the North Pole. It does, however, distort the shape and scale as you get increasingly further from the center. Nevertheless, it is the best map to represent the vast distances in an accurate fashion. In my interpretation of the far north, I have split it into 4 regions. The first is the Russian north. The second is the Scandinavian north. The third is the US and Canadian continental north. And the final region is Greenland and the Canadian archipelago. Each of them have unique differences which directly impact on their geopolitical relevance. The first region we will discuss is the Russian north. It has a population of some 2.5 million people and resources including world-leading gas reserves, as well as oil fields, nickel, palladium, coal, and gold, all of which are served by extensive northern ports, a northern rail corridors, an icebreaker fleet of some 52 ships, including 3 that are nuclear powered, and Arctic-specific airfields. There is a large military presence in Russia's Arctic, which includes the home base of the Northern Fleet, multiple radar installations, Arctic brigades, long-range aviation coverage, and multiple fighter-capable airstrips. In terms of sea accessibility, the Northern Sea Route, which runs across the Arctic Ocean north of Russia, is available from July to October, and of course the Russians insist you be escorted by one of their icebreakers. In addition, Murmansk, their main military base, is open year-round as it is ice-free. Heavy investment in infrastructure and state-sponsored settlement serve to solidify their Arctic dominance and control the maritime sea passage over the Northern Sea Route. The Scandinavian North. The Scandinavian North has a population of some 1 million people, split between 480,000 in northern Norway, 250,000 in northern Sweden, and some 180,000 in northern Finland, which is considered Lapland. Just as a reminder, this is where the Russian Murmansk major home of the Russians' northern fleet is. The northern part of Scandinavia is rich in resources including iron ore, rare earth minerals, forestry, fisheries, and offshore oil and gas. Its infrastructure includes advanced transport, ice-free ports including Tromsø and Narvik, Arctic universities and research centers. And as well, a military presence is in this part of of NATO's northern region, where Norway often hosts Arctic NATO exercises, including Exercise Cold Response. And as we all know, Finland and Sweden have recently joined Arctic, increasing Arctic readiness. Another important feature, of course, which we've already hinted at, is that Year-round sea accessibility is available due to the warm ocean currents that come up from the North Atlantic drift. And key ports, as I mentioned before, of Tromsø and Narvik are open year-round. The U.S. and Canadian continental north, which includes Alaska, Yukon, the Northwest Territories, and elements of Nunavut, has a population of approximately 1 million people. Interestingly, 730,000 of them are in Alaska. It is resource-rich with oil and gas, zinc, lead, gold, and diamonds, and ongoing rare earth exploration. The infrastructure is sparse, but includes a road that runs from Tuktoyaktuk through Inuvik, down the Mackenzie Highway, all the way to southern Canada. Internal to Alaska, there are more developed highways, particularly between the sites of Fairbanks and Anchorage. There are also deep water ports, particularly at Anchorage, but also there's a development in the U.S. of a potential deep water port at Nome, and Tuktoyaktuk is capable of taking ships of a limited size. The military presence across the north is governed by a joint U.S., Canadian, North American Air Defense Command, or NORAD, and it emphasizes forward posture. From the Canadian side, this includes 4 forward operating locations. One at Inuvik, which can host up to 6 fighter aircraft, Yellowknife, another 6 aircraft, Rankin Inlet, 4 fighter aircraft, Iqaluit, 6 fighter aircraft, and while there was one planned at Kedgewick, it was never completed. And of course, the U.S. has a heavy presence in the air bases in the vicinity of Fairbanks and Anchorage. In terms of sea accessibility, the sea is only available from July to October, limited by the sea ice in the shallow waters. Warming temperatures will have an impact on this, but it won't be as great as it is across the northern sea route. Greenland and Canada's Arctic archipelago. The population of this region is less than 100,000. 56,000 of this number live in Greenland, and the remainder in Canada's high Arctic, split between the Northwest Territories, but primarily Nunavut in the Arctic Islands, with the large majority of them living in Iqaluit, which is Nunavut's capital. Many would be familiar with efforts to find the Northwest Passage by the British and the Franklin expedition, which ended in tragedy in 1845. The Erebus, one of the ships involved, was discovered in 2014 by Parks Canada, who were ably assisted by the Inuits' oral history of the event. In terms of resources, there is the potential for oil and gas in the far north and talk of rare earths. There's also fisheries and some mining. Of note, there is only one operating mine in Canada's Arctic archipelago at Mary River. The Mary River mine produces iron ore, which is eventually shipped to Europe. Infrastructure is very limited. Some rough airstrips that support previous weather stations, which are now automated, but these airstrips are still used because the weather stations need to be serviced periodically. And there is only seasonal sea lift, which typically comes across the beaches of these various communities. The U.S. maintains a base at Thule, which has been renamed Patuxent, and in northwest Greenland. And of course, we are all familiar with Canada's base at Canadian Forces Station Alert, which is the furthest north populated center or permanently populated center in the world. Canada's operates the Arctic Surveillance or North Warning System backed up by RadarSat. There are Arctic Ranger patrols, some of which are in Canada's furthest north civilian inhabited site, which is Grise Fjord, also in Resolute Bay. These two sites were occupied in the 1950s by the Canadian government forcibly moving Inuit from northern Quebec to these two locations in order to cement or confirm our claim over this area as a sovereign site. And of course, there is the Northwest Passage. So from July to September, much of the Northwest Passage and the eastern Green Line coast is accessible due to the changes in the sea conditions, although it is a very tricky route, according to the sailors I've talked to navigate. If one was to emphasize the military significance of this region, we can see that any approach by Russia will come over either Alaska or Canada's north. And what's interesting in this NORAD depiction of the air defense identification zones is that much of Canada's Arctic archipelago is not surveilled on a 24/7 basis. That doesn't mean it's not surveilled at all. It just means that we don't have instantaneous warning of an approach through that red region that you see on this slide. Although we would detect a landing anywhere inside of that Arctic archipelago eventually, it just wouldn't be the unblinking eye that gives it to us. It's interesting to look at the comparative distances and transit times to get from A to B. The two most important container bases or container ports in the world are Shanghai and Rotterdam. And this chart shows the distances and transit time it takes to get there. The classic route is along the Suez Canal. And you can see here that that's some 27 to 35 days. However, if you were to take the Northern Sea route, you would trim an extensive amount of time off your transit, as well as through the Northwest Passage, although, as I mentioned before, it's navigationally more tricky. Some people ask why they don't use the rail route, which would take the cargo across Asia. And the real reason is not necessarily that it's shorter. It's definitely shorter and definitely faster. It's that it requires between, as this at the bottom of this note says here, over 100 to 200 trains to equal one ultra-large container vessel. So clearly, the most efficient way to move bulk cargo is going to be by sea for the foreseeable future. In terms of exercise Arctic Resolve, what we're trying to achieve here is to just generate some discussion about the options that Canada has for defending its north. The game is set up so that we can support up to 8 or 9 players with a commander-in-chief of the Russian forces, one for Canada, a single player for the US and NATO. The scenario has been established to create the conditions where we're going to force a liquefied natural gas convoy through the Northwest Passage, through Canada's archipelago, and Russia's going to try and stop them. The units that you can see on the board before you, not in the slide presentation, but on the displayed map, are in their initial locations where they are to the best of our ability from open source intelligence, including the occupation of Canada's forward operating locations. Here are the command appointments for this iteration of exercise Arctic Resolve. And you can see the forces for which these folks are responsible. Exercise Arctic Resolve should be tackled with a planning phase first. And in the military, we typically do this through a mission analysis, which answers the 5 W's: who, what, where, when, and why somebody is doing something. You will develop a broad concept of operations, or at least the commanders and chiefs will, which will be the how you're going to accomplish those 5 W's, and then you give those tasks out to your subordinate commanders. I'll initiate the scenario by creating the crisis in the Arctic archipelago that starts off the war game. And then when the game begins, it'll be in the order of play Russia, who hold the initiative, the US, Canada, and the implicated NATO allies, which are limited to the Danes and the Dutch. I'd ask that the commanders-in-chief designate their subordinate commanders in which sequence they will play in order to keep the action phase moving along. And the game will conclude at my discretion, followed by a discussion to determine what are the relevant deductions. What I would ask is that you don't fight the exercise scenario, and in the military we say that that's don't fight the white, and also that you record any feedback, both with respect to the conclusions you're drawing from the game and the game itself, how it can be improved. Next, let's talk about the game itself. First off is the map. The map was developed from this publicly available Government of Canada polar projection map of the Arctic. What I wanted to create was a playing surface that was 4,800 kilometers by 4,800 kilometers on a 48-inch by 48-inch table. If I superimpose that on this map to scale, this is the area of the far north that you're going to capture. Once you have the map to scale, you then overlay a hex grid on top of it, draw in manually the terrain, ensure that the coastlines, etc., are accurately followed, roads, minor rivers, lakes, etc., are all included on the map. One then ends up with a map like this, which is a clean map, accurate to scale, with a hex grid superimposed over top of it. How do we use this? First, it would be interesting to zoom into one area of the map and explain what the features are on it. So here is the zoomed in portion of the map. On it, you will see first that the hexes are 100 kilometers across. That's important to note. And there are 48 hexes from north to south and east to west. Tundra, represented here by the slightly brown color. Forest is green in color. The tree line is represented throughout. You have mountains, small communities like Sax Harbor, major rivers like the Mackenzie River, minor rivers, roads that run throughout the map, at least on the continent, and international boundaries. Obviously, the ocean is represented, and the lighter part of the ocean is the ice cap, the permanent ice cap. And here is the line of the summer ice. It's important to note this because it impacts how icebreakers are used in the game. Multiple units are represented in this simulation. Multi-role aircraft as an example, bombers, aerial refuelers, airborne early warning aircraft, maritime patrol aircraft, transport aircraft, and unmanned aerial drones. Each of these chits, which you can see on the map right now, represent, in most cases, 2 aircraft. So that's the case for fighter aircraft and bombers and transport aircraft. Each of those chits represent 2. And if you flip the chit over, you'll see it's marked with a 1, which simply denotes that it's been reduced by 1 aircraft. Because aircraft of these types typically fly in pairs. Aerial refuelers just represent the capability and not necessarily a number of aerial refuelers. Otherwise, we'd be counting gas until the cows came home. The airborne early warning aircraft and maritime patrol aircraft are singles because they typically fly their missions as lone aircraft, as do unmanned aerial drones. Now, each one of these units is represented by a unit capability card, which you can see here on the right. Don't be intimidated by these. This will be explained in some detail, but you'll become comfortable with it quite quickly. as well as aircraft, there are ships. So here we have the surface combatants, which represents a single frigate. This is the HMCS Montreal. Commercial ships like liquefied natural gas carriers, icebreakers like the Canadian Coast Guard Service, Terry Fox, and finally submarines like this SSN from the Russians. They are also represented by intricate unit capability cards. And here are some of the Russian examples. You'll notice that they have a SAM value, which is a reference to their surface-to-air missile capability. Again, we'll go through this in more detail on the board itself. Land units are obviously in the game as well. Combat arms units are a bit of an exception. We'll talk about them here shortly. You've got these units here: surface-to-surface missiles, surface-to-air missiles, and of course SOF. Combat arms units are not doubles. In other words, if you flip over a combat arms unit in the first full-up company, you'll get a company minus. If that company minus is reduced, it becomes a half company. So the chit is replaced with the half company chit. And if that is further reduced, it becomes a platoon until it no longer exists. And each of these units, again, is represented by a unit capability card, which you see here. Of course, there are the US ones, and you can see there's the Patriot Battery and the Typhoon. The unit placement table is used to place units in their initial starting positions according to what we could determine from open source intelligence. It's important because it's as accurate as we can make it and gives the idea of just how large Russian forces are, for example, and frankly, American forces in Alaska. What's even more important is that we hang on to this table throughout the game because it records the airfield capacity. That's AF cap in the second column. This is the capacity of an airfield to host aircraft. If an airfield is attacked and that capacity is reduced, then that clearly impacts the number of air assets that can be hosted at that airfield. Should the airfield capacity be less than the number of airplanes present, then you would have to eliminate the surplus airplanes, and that represents them being destroyed on the runway or in a hangar. In an effort to record, or to at least represent, the presence of the North Warning System long-range radars, we don't do the short-range radars, it would be too many markers. You can see these stars on this particular map, and you will see on the actual board blue wooden markers that indicate where the radar sites are. Each of these radar sites in the game has a range of some 500 kilometers or 5 hexes. Now let's look at some aspects of the game. If we were to represent quick reaction alert aircraft, QRA, you can see in Inuvik there are 6 CF-18s. Yes, 3 markers because each represent 2 aircraft, but 6 CF-18s. And coming out of Russia is a pair of MiG-31 BMs. So let's see how this works. First of all, the radar coverage, as I mentioned, is 5 hexes. So there's a radar range, and you can see the stars that represent the other radars. That gives a line of radar coverage that looks something like this. If the Russian aircraft launches, he doesn't get detected until he crosses that line. When he crossed into the first hex, that alerted Inuvik that something was on its way, so that when he got to the second hex, the Canadian aircraft could launch. Then, that's what we call the reaction. Then the Russian aircraft would continue on its course, as would the CF-18, until the moment that the 2 of them, moving 1 hex at a time, moved by each player, end up in the same hex and combat ensues. And we'll talk about combat in a later. Another option for the Canadian player is to put out standing patrols. One type of standing patrol is a combat air patrol. In this example, we'll use the CF-18 to put a standing patrol out, allowing it to react quicker to any incoming aircraft. But to put a standing patrol out of 2 aircraft, one would need a total of 6. two chits that remain on the base, and one that goes out to represent the Combat Air Patrol. And this represents the continuous circulation of aircraft through that patrol site. So in this instance, a CF-18, which has an operating range of 6 hexes, will go out, has an operating range of 9 hexes, will go out 6 hexes, here we are, in order to establish the Combat Air Patrol, leaving 2 chits behind, and that provides you with continuous coverage in that area. The radar or sensor range of a CF-18 is 2 hexes, which you see here. It also, because it's gone out 6, still has 3 hexes left that it can react to any incoming aircraft. So it can intercept anything out to that range. Of course, it has to be detected first. Now our Russian friend comes in. So he flies in, and he is acquired once he crosses that radar line. The CF-18 will then intercept. In the same manner as the previous example, where we used a quick reaction aircraft, as the Russian aircraft enters, the CF-18 can move 1 hex towards him, and when the Russian aircraft comes in, then combat ensues. How does air combat work? Well, we'll show you an example here. On this chart, we have the CF-18 to the left and the MiG-31BM to the right. So the first thing we need to do is determine what their stealth level is. This determines whether or not the dice will be rolled simultaneously or one before the other. In this case, they have the same stealth level, so they will both fire at the same time. They're both the same generation, 4th generation. So when the CF-18 rolls the dice, he's going to consult this part of the engagement table where it says Gen 4, and you see the numbers 32, 67, 91, and 98. Likewise, the MiG-31BM will use the numbers that you see here, 13, 54, 91, 98. So what does this mean? Let's say the CF-18 rolls 50. 50 is obviously greater than 32, but less than 67. And if you look at the engagement table, at least the top of the column, it says PK1, PK2, all the way to 6. PK1 means that you've killed 1 aircraft. Since 50 is greater than 32, but less than 67, that's the value you use. And the Russians suffer 1 loss. If the Russians were somehow fortunate enough to roll, let's say, 60, which is greater than 54, but less than 91, then the Russians would eliminate 2 enemy aircraft. And so when the combat was over, it would result in the Canadians losing 2 aircraft and the Russians losing 1, and then everybody would return home. Now let's say we have a different fight between a stealth fighter, an F-35, which we see here as a stealth level of 3, against a Russian Su-35 Sierra. In this particular instance, clearly the F-35 has greater stealth than the Su-35S. Therefore, it applies its combat results before the S-35S gets a chance to respond. So it's not simultaneously, essentially. Now, in this case, the S-35S is generation 4.5, so the Canadian is going to use the 4.5 table. And so if the Canadian was fortunate enough to roll more than 69, he would eliminate these aircraft before they even had a chance to respond. But let's say he rolled 14 and only eliminated 1 of them. Then, when the Russians shot back, he's shooting back at a generation 5 aircraft, and it's almost impossible for him to shoot it down. And this clearly demonstrates the advantage of stealth. There's one other aspect of stealth that we need to discuss. The Su-35S has a radar range of 3, but when you apply a stealth level of 3, you end up with an acquisition range of 0. In other words, the Su-35S does not see the F-35 until he is within 100 kilometers. In other words, occupying the same hex. That's significant, and you'll see how it plays out in the game. The game also includes standoff missiles, both land-based and air-launched, and sea-launched. And you can see here some examples. So if you have an engagement between a Typhoon battery, and the MST stands for Maritime Strike Tomahawk. In other words, this is a missile that's meant to hit ships at sea, and a Russian cruiser. In this case, you can see it here. The first thing you do is you determine the standoff range. So that ship has to be acquired, first of all. You can't just fire willy-nilly at any marker on the board. It has to be acquired by a sensor. And you can hit it out to a range of 16 from the location of the Typhoon battery. As it fires, it has to consider the SAM value. So for these missiles to penetrate and get to that ship, it needs to roll on two D10, two dice, two 10-sided dice, at least 93 or more. So you can see it's quite difficult to penetrate the surface-to-air missile capability of a Russian cruiser. And if it did manage to get through, it would apply the following results. So depending on how many other ships were present, and perhaps they would be cargo ships like the liquefied natural gas ships that we were talking about earlier, you would eliminate, guaranteed you would eliminate at least 3, and quite possibly you would get 4 or 5 ships with a single strike from a Typhoon battery. But you have to first defeat the SAM value. Same thing is true for the air-launched bomber. So here's the Russian Tu-22M. It doesn't have its own sensor, so it needs another sensor to pick something up. And if it's firing at a ship, it has a standoff range. Well, if it's starting at infrastructure, it has a standoff range of 15, and you can see just below that, if it's firing at a ship, it has a standoff range of 12, provided again that that ship is detected by a Russian sensor. And it's firing a hypersonic missile, the AS-24 Killjoy. It's firing against the HMCS Montreal, which has a lower SAM value, as you will notice, and that's largely because there just aren't that many interceptors on board the HMCS Montreal, or this style of frigate. And because it's hypersonic, you subtract 20 from that value. So all that the Russian has to defeat is to get 41 or more, and he penetrates. And if he penetrates, then of course the results are equally catastrophic, and you can see the Montreal is probably going to go to the bottom if its SAM coverage doesn't stand up. We will go over other aspects of the game on the board, but I just wanted to mention a couple of features. One is the escalation framework. You can see from this framework that the game is already going to have 2 actions that have taken place, and then there will be the initiation of the land force at Mold Bay, which I will insert. And as we go along, you can read these at your leisure, but you can see that there are consequences to every time you up the ante in order to react to one of your opponent's actions. It risks that he can go another level. And finally, there are cyber effects. You have 9 cards from which to choose. You choose, if you're the American, 2 of the 9 cards. You take those 9 cards, and I'm just going to cycle through them here slowly. You take those 9 cards and you place the one that you want in action face down on the table, and the other ones you keep to one side. If you're the Russian, you get 4 of these cards, and you can see that they're quite effective. These cards, and of course the Russian puts 1 face down and keeps the other 3 in reserve. At any time during a turn, at any time at all, you can play one of these cyber cards, and its action will be effective for the remainder of that turn, in other words, for 12 hours. So here you can see one of the final cards, which is interesting, disrupting the SAM battery. which results in a reduction in the SAM value of that particular unit.
Engage in conversation with the Americans at this point in time?
He's right here.
Perfect. Jim.
Hi. Okay. What I'd like to do is get.
That's the Americans.
It's a backfire.
You're helping them?
Let them in there.
It's Clinton in the White House.
Yeah.
Good morning. I'm Van Adamov from KPMG, and I want to share a couple of the lessons learned from the past couple of Arctic war games we played recently. First and foremost, we need more assets in the north. Airfields, equipment, subs, drones for surveillance, attack drones, and counter-drone warfare. This will allow better preparedness for patrolling and guarding the northern sea route and fending off any incursions. Second, we need clear rules of engagement sealed with our NATO allies. We cannot afford uncertainty over allies' action and assistance in case of an attack, and we need to prepare for the eventuality that some of them may not be there for us. And last but not least, we need strong responses to provocations and attacks to avoid further escalation. It may sound counterintuitive, but the best response, in fact the only response that stops a bully in their tracks, is the show of equal or greater force, coupled with a clear resolve to use it. We have superior military capability within NATO at the moment, and we need to send a clear message to our adversaries that we are willing to use it in our defense.
Hi, Eric. I'd just like to pass on a few notes from my role as the NATO Combined Joint Task Force Commander's position. Firstly, I'd like to commend Major General Thompson for his really masterful creation of this game. It permits all of the participants to truly exercise what has been originated and performed during the planning process. And it's for that reason that I would strongly recommend that this become incorporated into the JCSP program at the Canadian Forces Command and Staff College. I think that an inject of this nature would allow the participants there to truly realize the results of their intricate planning process and would really form the culmination of that exercise. Next, I think it was identified during the gaming that there's a significant deficiency in our surveillance of our far north. From seabed to sky, we're lacking a significant amount there, and that is certainly an area that I think we would benefit from. Thirdly, infrastructure became an obvious deficiency in our north. Our lack of paved runways and deep ports displayed a weakness in our defense and our surveillance, and from a sovereignty standpoint, we must be able to have that if we're going to truly protect the north against any adversaries. And lastly, engagements of our Indigenous people was mentioned by a few of the members, and I think this is paramount to any advancement that we're going to have there. Their understanding of the North, their understanding of survival in the North will be paramount to how we move forward. And without their inject, I think it would be a very bad move. So their engagement is absolutely paramount in the sovereignty of our nation. I'm sure you've heard many of these ideas before, but I thought I'd add my 2 cents worth, and hopefully it'll reinforce their comments as well.
In the lessons learned from the war game, given thought to a number of issues, they're basically, I have 2 strategic issues and 3 war game execution issues. I think it would be worth discussing.
Okay.
First, number 1 is the threat locus. The war game really proved in this particular scenario that the Western Arctic was an area of great vulnerability for us, and probably the predominant threat because of its geography, because of its proximity of resources, the proximity of the enemy, the proximity to the Northwest Passage, and the ocean sea conditions and what have you. So it's logically an area of key threat. But as far as where the threat locus would actually fall, I would also suggest that we might want to consider several other areas, basically in the high Arctic archipelago. And the first one there would be in the Sverdrup Basin, which is it's north of Lancaster Sound, north of Resolute Bay and Little Cornwallis Island, a vast area of oil and gas, one of the biggest in the world, one of the biggest known reserves in the world. And it would behoove us to watch out to protect that from foreign aggression, I believe. So we're looking at the Sverdrup Basin. We're also looking at the fact that foreign countries are challenging, some of them are challenging Canada's sovereignty over the Northwest Passage. And the definitions of sovereignty vary, but one of the key factors in the international sphere is the ability to occupy land and territory in order to establish sovereignty. And if we're occupying both sides of, say, the Lancaster Sound, which is the choke point of the Northwest Passage, we can really have a very strong, even stronger case for sovereignty by doing so. Now, the Lancaster Sound is south of Cornwallis Island. So Sverdrup Basin is north of Cornwallis Island. Lancaster Sound is south of Cornwallis Island. And then once again, we also have the Russians who are pushing their claims in the Arctic. And one of them is the Lomonosov Ridge, which extends from the Russian continental shelf straight up to the North Pole and back down towards Canada and kind of veers off towards Greenland at the Arctic archipelago stage. So that's sort of where the threat locus lies. Now, how might we respond to that? Really, we would need to have strategic bases in the Resolute Bay area. Resolute Bay, Nanisivik, Pond Inlet, Arctic Bay area. That's one relatively local area where we would be both sides of the channel there, and we could perhaps upgrade Resolute so it could take fighter jets and long-range patrol aircraft. We could have Nanisivik. The runway there could be, it's long enough. It would just have to be paved. It could be a deep water port. There are a lot of good reasons why we could, by doing sort of demonstrating a strategic locus there, have quite a different war game. If those places were gamed out with developed capability, the results of the war game could actually be quite interesting, and it might prove the need and the location for the next series of investments by various levels. Also, it would help the communities, it would help locals, communities, governments, and the various interest groups. So that was just a point for the future. The war game might one day have a scenario where those bases come into operation, and we'd see how successfully we could defend ourselves against Russian aggression. As far as the execution of the game is concerned, I think there are three quick points I'd probably throw in there. And one is for credibility with observers outside of the military, for example, who don't know who know the Arctic but don't know military capability. I think it would help to have a weather wild card or a weather card somehow in play in the game, where maybe a dice might be rolled before a particular move, just to make sure the weather doesn't get in the way. And by weather, it could be anything. I mean, for example, if the wind changes in the Arctic, so do the ice conditions. The pack ice moves, the shore fast ice breaks loose. Suddenly ships can't sail out of port. Suddenly they can't go through passages they expected to. You may suddenly get an ice fog in an airfield, so you cannot dispatch the aircraft you plan to dispatch. Terrestrially, an ice road might have an unusual breakup because we are looking at land transportation on some of the cases. And we also have solar weather. You know, a lot of aircraft flying over the pole now have to have solar weather forecasts before they dispatch. And so we have issues with communications disruption and geomagnetic disturbances and what have you. So once again, a dice roll or a card before a key move, or even before a consolidation move, might show the difficulties of actually executing an attack or a defense in the Arctic. Second issue I think might be worth looking at is seasonality. Just to recall that the Russians might not, or any enemy might not choose to do something aggressive in the Canadian North at the most convenient time for the defense to defend against it. For example, you might try shoulder season at the end of the shipping season where they can quickly move something into position and we can't outposition them because the weather closed down on us and we're now into winter darkness or something like that. So I think some sort of consideration might be worthwhile, especially for it to be considered realistic by casual observers in the non-military sphere, if we actually allowed some sort of consideration of seasonality. And the third and last thing I found in the game was the pace of play. Very good for air, very good for other forces, but the marine, the shipping pace really slowed the game down. It was kind of glacial. And the issue there, I think, might be to have it would be slightly unrealistic, but have an accelerated pace at which ships could move in the Arctic and through the Northwest Passage. That way, the game would resolve itself quicker, and you could actually have it hold an audience longer with greater levels of interest. And those are really my comments on the game. Thoroughly enjoyed the game, really enjoyed it. Honored to be there. Lots of interesting people. Would love to do it again. And that's really kind of what I have to say.
Thanks, Eric. My thoughts coming from the game were as follows. The first was the true significance of climate change to Canada in particular. Through my lifetime, Canada has realistically had two oceans, a long land border, and the North has been pretty much a impenetrable territory. But while we've concentrated on some of the catastrophic effects of climate change, floods, fires, and such, it seems that the fact that the North may very well be within our lifetimes a significant highway of international commerce is a real event in our nation's history. If the Arctic becomes essentially a form with the Suez Canal with worldwide implications, this is something that Canada needs to be prepared about and think about quite a bit. Another issue from the game, from my perspective, was the importance of submarines, subsurface assets in the Arctic. In the game, I played the American player, and we had one nuclear submarine asset, and it was fairly significantly tasked. It had the ability to land a SEAL team. So if that was necessary, it had the ability to do subsurface to surface and to ground attacks. And it also had the ability to fight other ships or ships and submarines. It also had the ability to transit underneath the Arctic pack ice. The Russian player had 3 subsurface assets, and he deployed them in a way in which he surged the assets underneath the pack ice so that at the time the game ended, there were significant Russian assets available to contribute to an opposed transit of the convoy. In response, we had the one asset, which I'd used, but frankly had more jobs than it had the ability to do. There was a Canadian subsurface asset in the game. It didn't come into play. And my concern thinking about this as well is that the ability to go underneath the pack ice was only limited to those submarines which were nuclear capable. Canada's in the process of acquiring submarines to replace its current assets, and it's worth thinking about how useful a new asset would be in the Arctic when we're making that purchase decision. Another fact that concerned me with the game was the geography of the Arctic. It's much bigger than you would think, especially if you haven't ever been up there. But how busy the Western Arctic was compared to the Eastern Arctic during the game suggests that our planning should also take that sort of thinking into account. Often when there's an announcement about actions in the Arctic, it comes to us building infrastructure in Iqaluit or the Eastern Arctic, when in fact our game suggested that the action is going to be at the western entrance to the Northwest Passage, and that we need to do more there. Another observation I had was the effect of logistics in the Arctic. Everything has to be moved in place, and it's very important to have both ammunition of all the kinds you need and the ability to use that ammunition. One thing that happened part of the game was an attack on Inuvik, in which a Patriot battery had been provided by the Americans to the Canadians to defend that area, and it completely used all its ammunition in part of the Russian attack. And the Russian attack was mostly successful simply because of the volume that was fired at them and the more limited ability of the defenders to respond. So I look at that in terms of Canadian surface assets to see how useful they would be in their ability to put up sufficient fire to slow down or deter a strike package aimed at them. Another observation from the Arctic is that everything has to fly in. And so having the ability to both aerial refueling, airborne early warning, and air transport are absolutely necessary. In the game, the only infantry units that moved at all, or ground units that moved at all, moved because an air unit put them somewhere. So the ability to get somewhere, the Army's ability to get somewhere on its own without air support does not exist. Because of the way the game went, I think my last observation is that despite really good play by all the players, it became apparent that United States intervention would be necessary at Canada's, not just its current state of preparedness, but even because the game was put in 2027, the more advanced state of preparedness that asset purchases between now and 2027, or assumed asset purchases, would give us. In the circumstances, it was apparent that United States intervention would almost certainly be absolutely desperately necessary in order to preserve the Canadian position in the Arctic. And while for game purposes, given that the threat was a Russian intervention and essentially seizing the entrance to the Northwest Passage, which was something that the United States, practically speaking, would not and could not abide, the risk is, of course, that Canada's ability to look after itself is insufficient as present, and we rely upon the Americans. And one thing that I know a number of people are concerned about is whether America's best interests and our own will always coincide in this area.
Well, I first off, I must admit, hats off to all the participants, but particularly to the good general and Dr. Dan yourself. It was well laid out, well orchestrated. Things that was reinforced because I've operated up in the Arctic was the issues relating to logistics, because of the distances that you have to be covered, not to mention the type of weather that would be confronting any sort of military organization, or for that matter, civilian organization, who wish to operate up there. The other aspect that I found rather fascinating is the dearth of military resources up there. And a lot of that has to do with a lack of civilian infrastructure, because usually we twin all that, dual purpose, of course, as you know, Eric. I think that's an extremely important aspect. And then not really understanding, because we're not up there all the time, training and exposed to the type of climate, the terrain, and the requirements to sustain life up there. It's very, very difficult to just plop people down. This is there's a big difference in my view between what we call winter warfare and Arctic warfare. And when I was up there, it went to with wind chill -60. So you basically, it's survival then. From then on, you're in your tents and you have guidelines from one tent to another, and everyone's essentially kipping and surviving, with one or two individuals that are securing the area, on a rotational basis. So that is important. And my other concern that I never really mentioned was the Chinese and the Russians and the North Koreans have a very big interest in electromagnetic pulse. And should you have not hardened equipment, communications, and navigational equipment, an electromagnetic pulse, you'll find yourself, how to say, without comms, lost, and without any support. And so it behooves us to harden our equipment and look at multi means of navigation, and especially in the Arctic, sun compass, because it's passive. The other aspect is some people are very good at dead reckoning navigation. There's going to be some fundamentals to that, and we even know that the American Navy has gone back to navigation by the stars, because they're concerned of the issue relating to all the GPS satellites going down, because the Chinese and the Russians focus the high ground as a main battle space for the next conflict. So their ability to have eyes on, to communicate, and to provide navigational skill sets becomes very problematic very, very quickly.
So, hi, I'm Simon Waring, member of the RCMI. I participated in the Arctic Wargaming scenario last week at the RCMI. I was on Team Canada, so probably one of the most striking things that I came away with were the difficulty of moving Canadian kit and being able to deploy it in the Arctic Circle, and especially to put aircraft in the skies over the Arctic archipelago, especially around Mold Bay, which in this scenario was occupied by small Russian ground forces, and most concerning for the Royal Canadian Air Force in this scenario, some surface-to-air missile, a surface-to-air missile battery. So definitely the logistical constraints are difficult. If you don't already have things up there, it's hard to move things up there rapidly. Also, the sheer distance, the scale involved is quite breathtaking, and a major factor to take into account as well. And I suppose the major point from an operational perspective is, if you don't have allied, whether Canadian, American, NATO, surface-to-air batteries of our own deployed, it's very difficult to prevent the Russians from actually being able to land their own troops and equipment in our high north. And once they get things on the ground, it's very costly in terms of equipment and human life to evict them from Canadian soil. So for me, at least, the major task or challenge is finding a way to be able to deter, or if Russian aircraft end up breaching our airspace, to prevent them from being able to land troops and equipment. Because once they're on the ground, it's very tough to get them out.